My name is Rachel Morgan. I am 31 years old and I'm from Atlanta, Georgia. What happened at our family reunion wasn't just humiliating, it was a public execution of respect. And my father never imagined I'd respond the way I did. Have you ever been embarrassed by someone who was supposed to protect you? What would you do if your own father stood up in front of the entire family, raised his glass and said, "I'm proud of all my children except the loser," then looked straight at you? Would you laugh it off? Would you cry in silence? Or would you wait for the perfect moment to respond? And what if the very thing he mocked was the same thing that gave you quiet power he knew nothing about? Because sometimes the best revenge isn't loud. It's documented, delivered, and irreversible. Stay till the end, this one shocked everyone. Family reunions in my family were never about love. They were about comparison. Who bought the bigger house? Whose kids were doing better? And most importantly, who my father approved of this year. Still, I showed up. I wore a simple dress, nothing flashy, nothing that screamed success or failure. I hugged relatives I barely knew. I smiled when people asked polite questions about my work, even though they never really waited for the answer. In my family, careers were only impressive if they came with titles people recognized immediately: doctor, lawyer, executive. Anything else was just noise. The reunion was held in a rented banquet hall, the kind with fake chandeliers and long white tables. My dad loved places like that. He liked an audience. He liked being seen as the loud, successful patriarch who had built everything from nothing. That narrative mattered more to him than the truth ever did. About halfway through the evening, after dinner plates were cleared and drinks had loosened tongues, my father stood up. I knew something was coming the moment he reached for the microphone. He tapped it twice, smiling like a man about to deliver wisdom. Conversations faded, chairs turned, all eyes went to him. I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, the instinctive warning my body had learned over years of moments like this. He started with jokes, stories about the good old days, about sacrifice, about how hard it was to raise kids who didn't always appreciate what you gave them. People laughed politely, some nodded, others glanced at their own children. Then he raised his glass. "I just want to say," he announced, voice loud and confident, "that I'm proud of all my children." Applause started. A few relatives clapped enthusiastically. My siblings smiled. For half a second, just half, I felt hope creep in. Maybe this was different. Maybe age had softened him. Then he paused. "And I mean all of them," he continued, "except the loser." The room went silent. I didn't need him to say my name. I didn't need him to point. He turned his head and looked directly at me. Not with anger, not even disappointment, with amusement. Laughter followed, not from everyone but enough. Nervous chuckles, awkward smiles. That horrible sound people make when they don't want to be uncomfortable, so they choose cruelty instead. I felt heat rush to my face. My hands went cold, my ears rang. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Someone else looked down at their phone, and my father, he smiled wider. "Hey," he added, waving a dismissive hand, "not everyone can be a success. Someone has to show the kids what not to do, right?" That's when it hit me, not just the humiliation but the calculation behind it. This wasn't a joke gone wrong. This was intentional. He wanted to remind everyone who held power in that room. He wanted to cement a hierarchy. Golden children on one side, the failure on the other. And he wanted to do it publicly, so I couldn't rewrite the story later. What he didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that I had spent years building something quietly. Something that didn't come with applause or bragging rights at family dinners. Something that didn't need his approval to exist. But in that moment, none of that mattered yet. All that mattered was that he thought he'd won. I didn't cry, I didn't stand up, I didn't walk out, I sat there, calm, still. And I watched him soak in the attention, completely unaware that the very people laughing around him were connected, financially, professionally, contractually, to things he didn't fully understand. Because my father's greatest weakness wasn't his cruelty, it was his arrogance. He believed success only looked one way. He believed titles defined worth. He believed I was powerless because I was quiet. And as he handed the microphone back and accepted praise from relatives who feared him, I realized something very clear. This wasn't just a family insult. This was a corporate mistake. One that would unravel slowly, professionally, and in a way he could never dismiss as just family drama. I smiled back at him across the table. not because I forgave him, but because I knew, right then, that the reunion was only the beginning. Being called a loser at that reunion didn't hurt because it was new. It hurt because it was familiar. My father had been planting that label on me my entire life, slowly and carefully, like a stain he wanted everyone else to notice before I ever could wash it off. It started early. When I was a kid, praise in our house was conditional. Straight A's weren't impressive unless they were better than my siblings. Awards only mattered if my father could brag about them to someone important. If I achieved something quietly, it barely existed. If I failed publicly, it became family folklore. I learned quickly that love wasn't given, it was earned, and even then it could be taken back. By the time I reached high school, the comparisons were constant. My siblings were driven, focused, going places. I was creative, which in my father's language meant unreliable. When I talked about ideas instead of titles, he smiled the way people do when they don't take you seriously. College made it worse. I didn't choose a path he understood. I didn't chase prestige, I chased independence. And from that moment on, he treated my life like a cautionary tale he could point to whenever someone needed motivation. Don't end up like her. She had potential once. She's just not built for pressure. He never said these things directly to my face. That would have required courage. Instead, he said them loudly to other people, making sure I was close enough to hear. At family gatherings, he'd ask my siblings about promotions, bonuses, 5-year plans. When it was my turn, he'd say, "So, still figuring things out?" and laugh like it was harmless. I laughed too. That's the part no one talks about, the way you learn to laugh along just to survive. Inside, though, something was breaking. I started measuring myself through his disappointment. Every choice I made felt wrong before it even failed. I questioned opportunities I should have taken. I downplayed wins before anyone else could. I became so used to being underestimated that I stopped correcting people, and my father loved that. Because the quieter I became, the louder his narrative sounded. What hurt most wasn't the insults, it was the erasure. He never asked what I was building. He never cared to understand what I did for work. In his mind, if it didn't come with a job title he could brag about, it didn't count. The irony? That ignorance became my shield. While he dismissed me, I learned how power really works. I learned how money moves quietly, how contracts speak louder than personalities, how influence doesn't need applause to exist. But emotionally, the damage was already done. I spent years feeling like I had to justify my existence. Years over-explaining myself to people who had already decided I wasn't worth listening to. Years shrinking myself so others wouldn't feel uncomfortable with my ambition. And every time I considered confronting him, I stopped. Because deep down, I still wanted his approval. That's the part that's hardest to admit. I wanted one moment where he looked at me the way he looked at my siblings. One moment where he said, "I was wrong about you." I kept hoping that if I worked harder, stayed quieter, succeeded better, he'd finally see me. He never did. Instead, he used my silence as proof that he was right. By the time that reunion happened, I wasn't just carrying embarrassment. I was carrying years of internalized failure that wasn't even mine. Years of being told, directly and indirectly, that I was the weak link in the family chain. So when he called me a loser in front of everyone, it didn't just sting. It reopened every moment I'd swallowed my voice, every dinner where I felt invisible, every time I convinced myself I deserved less, and yet something shifted. For the first time, I didn't feel small. I felt clear, because humiliation stops hurting when you realize it's not about you, it's about control. And my father didn't humiliate me because I failed. He humiliated me because I no longer needed him, and that terrified him. That was the moment I stopped craving his approval and started planning my distance, not emotional distance, but strategic distance, the kind that turns underestimation into leverage. He thought he had spent years breaking me. What he actually did was teach me how to survive without validation. And that lesson, it was going to cost him far more than he realized. After the reunion, people expected a reaction, a message, a confrontation, a dramatic post on social media, anything. When none of that happened, they relaxed. That was the first mistake. Silence makes arrogant people comfortable. They assume the story ended where they left it. My father certainly did. He went back to his life convinced he'd put me in my place, convinced the room had validated him. And I let him believe that. I still showed up to birthdays. I still smiled politely at family dinners. I answered his questions with vague, non-threatening replies. I never corrected him when he misunderstood my work, never clarified when he minimized it. Every time he underestimated me, he handed me information. I started listening instead of defending. I listened to the way he bragged about his company, about expansion plans, new partnerships, a big move coming soon. I noticed how often he repeated the same names. Which relatives were suddenly important, which friends he treated carefully. Patterns emerge when you stop reacting. At family events, he'd talk freely, assuming no one there could challenge him professionally. He didn't realize I spoke the same language, just a quieter dialect. He didn't know I recognized leverage when I heard it, and I took mental notes. I noticed how often he complained about one particular board member, how he relied heavily on one major client, how his business confidence rose and fell based on a few key contracts. He was powerful, but not untouchable. Meanwhile, I worked, not loudly, not visibly. I built relationships he didn't know about. Sat in meetings where his name came up neutrally, professionally, without family context. I listened to people describe him without reverence, just another executive with predictable habits. That was eye-opening. The man who terrified me growing up, he was just human in those rooms, and humans leave trails. I never gossiped, never hinted at personal history. I let my work speak first. People trusted me because I didn't overshare, because I didn't posture, because I didn't need credit, and slowly doors opened. I learned who audited his accounts, who insured his company, who handled compliance, not because I went digging, but because silence makes people talk and competence makes them confide. At the same time, I observed my father more closely than ever. I watched how he treated people he thought were beneath him, how he cut corners when he felt rushed, how his ego guided decisions more than logic. Power had made him sloppy. And still, I said nothing. That restraint wasn't easy. Every instinct in me wanted to confront him, to reclaim my dignity loudly, to demand an apology he would never give sincerely. But I had learned something critical over the years. People like my father don't feel shame from words. They feel it from consequences, so I waited. I let him underestimate me publicly, while I gained credibility privately. I let him repeat his loser joke to friends who nodded along, unaware that their businesses were connected, indirectly, to decisions I now influenced. The irony was almost poetic. He thought silence meant surrender. I knew it meant positioning. By the time he noticed something was off, by the time deals started slowing, questions started coming, meetings started feeling colder, it was too late to trace it back to me. That's the beauty of strategic silence. There's no accusation to deny, no argument to win, just outcomes. And one evening, as I sat across from him at another family gathering, listening to him complain about unfair corporate politics, I realized something chilling. He was already feeling the consequences. He just didn't know where they came from. Yet, I met his eyes, smiled softly, said nothing, because the loudest revenge isn't exposure, it's inevitability. The second family reunion came 6 months later. Same venue, same people, same fake smiles. My father looked different this time, not weaker, just unsettled. He laughed a little too loudly. Checked his phone more than usual. Bragged less. The man who once dominated every room now kept glancing at the door, like he was waiting for something he couldn't name. He didn't know that I was the reason. Dinner passed. Conversations blurred. Then, like clockwork, someone suggested speeches. My father hesitated. That alone told me everything. When he finally stood, microphone in hand, his words lacked their usual swagger. He praised family, talked about unity, about misunderstandings. He even glanced at me once, briefly, then looked away. That was my cue. I stood up before he could sit back down. The room stilled. People weren't used to hearing my voice in moments like this. I'd trained them not to expect it. I didn't plan to say anything, I began calmly, but after last year I think clarity matters more than comfort. A few heads turned, someone inhaled sharply, my father stiffened. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick envelope. Not flashy, not dramatic, plain, heavy, the kind of thing that carries weight before it's ever opened. I want to give you this, I said, walking toward him. You once called me a loser, I just wanted you to have the full picture. I placed the envelope in his hands. He laughed nervously. "What's this?" he asked, trying to sound amused. "Documentation," I replied. "Thought you'd appreciate that." He didn't open it right away, pride wouldn't let him. Instead, he smiled for the room, cracked a joke, and sat down. But his fingers tightened around the envelope like it might bite. Minutes passed, then whispers started. Because envelopes like that don't stay quiet, he finally opened it. I watched his face change in stages, confusion first, then calculation, then fear. Inside were copies, never originals. Corporate filings, partnership agreements, compliance reports, audit summaries, nothing illegal on its own, nothing dramatic, just enough to tell a story. A story about how dependent his company had become on third-party vendors, how certain contracts were structured on fragile assumptions, how one misstep could trigger reviews he couldn't afford. At the bottom was a simple letter, not threatening, not emotional, just factual. It explained my role professionally, not personally, the advisory positions I held, the networks I operated in, the decisions I influenced without ever needing my name attached. And the final line, "I thought you should know who you were laughing at." My father's hands shook. He looked up at me, eyes searching, angry, confused, scared. For the first time in my life, he didn't see a child, he saw a risk. "What is this?" he whispered. I leaned in, voice low. "It's context." The room felt colder. A relative asked if everything was okay. My father forced a smile and nodded, but his attention never left me. He suddenly understood that the setbacks he'd been facing weren't random. They were connected, and they led back to me. Not because I attacked him, but because I existed in spaces he never bothered to look. I returned to my seat. The room buzzed with curiosity, but no one dared ask questions. Power had shifted, and everyone could feel it. My father didn't finish the evening. He left early, envelope tucked under his arm like a liability he couldn't discard. That night he called me. Not to apologize, to negotiate. And that was how I knew I'd won. Because when someone who once humiliated you publicly starts asking for a conversation, it's not reconciliation, it's survival. My father didn't sleep that night. I know because he called me at 6:12 a.m., his voice rough, stripped of the confidence I'd heard my entire life. No greeting, no anger, just urgency. "We need to talk," he said, not want, need. That single word confirmed everything. We met later that afternoon in his office, the one I used to be scared of as a kid, floor-to-ceiling windows. Framed awards, photographs that told a carefully curated story of dominance and success. This time, the room felt smaller. He gestured for me to sit. I didn't rush. Power moves are often about pace, and I'd learned that lesson well. He started talking immediately, explaining, justifying, reframing, how things had been misunderstood. How family shouldn't get mixed up with business. How last year's comment was just a joke. I let him talk. When he finally paused, I asked one question. "Why now?" He blinked. "You've had years to apologize," I continued calmly. "Why is today different?" Silence. Then he admitted it without meaning to, because banks were asking questions, because partners were hesitating. Because someone had flagged structural risks that couldn't be ignored anymore. And because suddenly, my name carried weight in rooms he wasn't invited into. That was the moment I realized something important. I didn't need revenge. I had leverage. I told him the truth, not emotionally but strategically. I wasn't going to expose him. I wasn't going to destroy his company. I didn't need to. Consequences were already in motion, and nothing I said could stop or accelerate them significantly. What I did want was simple: respect. Not performative, not public, structural, no more jokes, no more dismissals, no more rewriting my story for his comfort. I also made one condition very clear. Our relationship going forward would exist on my terms. Personal life and professional life would remain separate, and any attempt to blur that line would be met with distance, not confrontation. He nodded. That nod meant more than any apology could have. Because for the first time, he wasn't granting approval. He was accepting reality. Over the next few months, I watched the shift happen quietly. My father stopped speaking over me at gatherings. He asked before offering opinions. He introduced me differently to people who mattered, not proudly, carefully. The family noticed. So did everyone else, and something unexpected happened. I didn't feel victorious. I felt free. Free from proving myself, free from carrying his disappointment, free from the version of me that thought success had to be loud to be real. The power flip wasn't explosive. There was no public downfall, no dramatic apology, no final confrontation, just a new balance. He learned that the child he underestimated had grown into someone he couldn't control. And I learned that the most effective revenge isn't humiliation, it's independence. Because when someone who once defined you realizes they no longer have the authority to do so, that's not just revenge, that's closure. If this story hit a nerve, you're not alone. If you've ever been underestimated, talked down to, or labeled a failure by the very people who should have believed in you, this was for you. So do me a favor. Like this video if you believe silence can be powerful. Subscribe if you know success doesn't need permission. And comment below, have you ever been doubted by family and proved them wrong without saying a word? Your story might be the next one we tell. Because sometimes the strongest revenge is living so well they're forced to watch.